winter of 1858, the roaring furnaces of Birmingham's ironworks became the stage for an act so violent it would echo for generations. Brutus Caldwell, an enslaved man who had endured 13 years without violence, swung a 20-pound sledgehammer with such force that his master's skull shattered like fruit dashed against stone. The sound reverberated through the foundry like a death knell, a crack that 17 witnesses would never forget. But the horror uncovered afterward was far darker than the murder itself. It revealed a conspiracy buried beneath molten iron and smoke, a truth so dangerous that the city's most powerful men spent decades covering it up. The question was never simply why Brutus killed, but what could drive a man long thought submissive to such ferocity that bones snapped audibly over the roar of the furnaces. Blood hissed and steamed against the scalding floor, the air filling with the sinister sound of serpents dying in fire. Before uncovering the grim secrets of Birmingham's iron empire, remember this: stories like these are not lost by chance. They are erased deliberately, buried by men with power who feared the truth. What happened here could have happened anywhere in America, in places where human lives were treated as expendable fuel for progress. To understand Brutus Caldwell's story, we must begin with the rise of Birmingham itself. Though not officially founded until 1871, its foundations were forged decades earlier in the blood and sweat of enslaved laborers. In 1858, the region was still little more than mining camps, scattered across Jefferson County, a land once sacred to the Cherokee, whose burial grounds lingered like forgotten prayers. Settlers, however, saw not hallowed ground, but untold wealth in the earth itself. Here lay the perfect trinity of industry, iron ore, coal, and limestone, all within reach, a geological jackpot destined to transform the South. Iron could be scratched from the ground by hand, coal burned endlessly to feed the furnaces, and limestone quarried from cathedral-like hills completed the alchemy of steel. This wealth, however, came at a terrible cost. At the center of it all was Cornelius Sloth, a man as ruthless as he was ambitious. Barely 5'6", with icy eyes and prematurely gray hair, he was no planter content with cotton. He saw the South's future in fire and steel, not crops that withered in storms or blight. Arriving from Pennsylvania in 1847, armed with northern industrial knowledge and letters of introduction, Sloth recognized opportunity where others saw only risk. To him, Alabama's greatest resource was not just the land, but the enslaved men forced to labor without reprieve, their lives burned away like the coal they shoveled. By 1855, Sloth Ironworks had become the largest industrial operation in Jefferson County, driven by the labor of more than 300 enslaved workers. The furnaces raged at over 2,000 degrees, turning the foundry floor into a living vision of hell, a place where men were treated as tools, their bodies as disposable as the iron they forged. And it was here, in this crucible of greed and suffering, that Brutus Caldwell's hammer fell, unleashing a chain of events that no amount of iron or smoke could bury forever. Workers at Sloth Ironworks endured 16-hour shifts in air so thick with smoke and metallic dust that every breath was a battle. Their lungs filled slowly with the residue of industry, and death came 3 times faster here than on the cotton fields. Cornelius Sloth saw this not as tragedy, but as mathematics. Slaves could always be purchased cheaply from the declining plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas. Iron ore, however, was finite. His equation was simple: workmen until they broke, then replace them with new bodies at the lowest cost. Human lives reduced to ledger entries, pennies per pound of iron. Brutus Caldwell entered this nightmare in the spring of 1855, purchased for the steep sum of $200 from the estate of Harrison Kendall, a Virginia planter ruined by gambling debts. Kendall had called Brutus the finest piece of property I ever owned, praising his obedience and strength, while dismissing him as too simple to cause trouble. At 28, Brutus was anything but ordinary, towering at 6'3" when most men barely cleared 5.5. His frame was built by years of relentless labor. His copper-toned skin carried the map of his suffering whip scars across his back. Burn marks etched on his forearms, calloused palms thick as rawhide. Yet it was his eyes that unsettled people most dark, sharp, quietly recording every cruelty as if tallying a debt that one day demanded repayment. At Sloth's foundry, he was assigned to the sledge gang, the men who shattered massive chunks of ore with 20-pound hammers so they could be fed into the furnace's maw. The work was punishing. Few lasted more than 5 years before their spines bent. Their lungs turned black with dust, their bodies ruined beyond repair. Most could barely swing a hammer for 6 hours before collapsing in exhaustion. Brutus routinely drove his hammer for 10, his rhythm steady, relentless, precise. The others began to work in time with him, the boom and crack of his hammer becoming the heartbeat of the foundry, the grim music of survival. Boom, crack, boom, crack. The sound was a funeral drum measuring out the lives of men waiting for death or freedom. But beneath the monotonous rhythm, Brutus was preparing for something else. Each swing of that hammer was practice, every motion a rehearsal for an act that would shatter more than iron. By late 1858, his fellow slaves began noticing subtle shifts in the man who had always been silent and predictable. He started asking questions, pointed deliberate questions. Which overseers worked which hours? Which corners of the foundry went unpatrolled? Which routes offered the quickest escape? His inquiries were not idle curiosity, but careful intelligence gathering executed with the precision of a soldier planning a campaign. And then there were the visitors. In the slave quarters, privacy was an illusion. Every whisper could be overheard, every gesture observed by spies eager to curry favor with the masters. Yet somehow Brutus managed to meet with strangers who slipped like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness. No one knew who they were or how they reached him, but their presence whispered of a larger design, a conspiracy moving silently behind the smoke and fire of Birmingham's iron empire. Figures emerged from the woods surrounding the foundry, moving like phantoms in the mist. They signaled to Brutus in ways no one else could decipher, leaving behind objects no slave should have possessed. Sheets of paper covered in writing that Brutus studied by candlelight before carefully burning to ash. Small parcels wrapped in oiled cloth that clinked softly when handled. Once, even a leather pouch that jingled with the weight of coins. These objects hinted at connections far beyond the ironworks alliances that frightened the other workers. Whatever Brutus was planning, it had support and resources no ordinary slave could hope to muster. Samuel Hutchkins, a fellow laborer stationed beside Brutus, later testified that he once caught sight of his friend writing in a tiny notebook with a pencil worn nearly to dust. When Samuel asked what he was doing, Brutus replied simply, "A man needs to keep track of things. You never know when records might come in handy." That notebook vanished in the chaos after the murder, but Samuel swore it had been filled with names and numbers written so small they looked like ant trails marching across the page. December 15th, 1858. Dawned gray and bitterly cold. A winter storm swept down from the north, coating the ground in ice and turning the foundry into a death trap. Outside, the air bit like knives. Inside, the furnaces roared at full blast, straining to meet a holiday deadline, for railroad iron Cornelius Sloth had promised to deliver. The clash of freezing wind and blistering heat created a volatile, explosive environment. Men slipped on icy walkways and tumbled into molten metal. Others collapsed from exhaustion, trampled underfoot by fellow slaves unable to stop the ceaseless rhythm of production. Life already cheap became even cheaper under the crush of deadlines. At 3:17 in the afternoon, Cornelius Sloth descended for his daily inspection tour. He never missed one. Dressed like a general parading before his army, he wore imported silks, tailored wool, and gleaming boots that mocked the soot-stained misery around him. In one hand, he carried his polished hickory walking stick, not as an aid, but as a weapon, a reminder that his authority was enforced with violence. His visits always spread dread. Sloth relished finding fault, and his punishments could linger in memory longer than scars. But today, Sloth wasn't alone. Two strangers walked beside him, men who didn't belong in the choking heat of an ironworks. Their clean clothes, polished shoes, and leather portfolios marked them as outsiders, businessmen, perhaps, or government agents. Their presence only sharpened the tension already coiled across the foundry floor. What followed was witnessed by 17 people, though their accounts diverged wildly. The only thing everyone agreed upon was this: Cornelius Sloth was standing near furnace number 3, berating Samuel Hutchkins for working too slowly when Brutus Caldwell set down the ore he had been breaking. After hours of mechanical rhythm, he stopped, lifted his 20-pound sledgehammer, and began walking toward his master. His steps were measured deliberate calm. The air itself seemed to tighten. Witnesses later admitted they knew something terrible was about to happen, yet disbelief pinned them in place. Mr. Sloth Brutus said, his deep voice carrying over the roar of fire and steel. His tone was polite, almost deferential, belying the storm that hung in the air. "I got something for you, sir." Cornelius Sloth turned, and for the first time his workers saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not surprise, not anger, but the primal terror of a man who recognized death when it came for him. Sloth's face drained of color, his hickory cane trembling as if it weighed more than iron. For a heartbeat, he seemed frozen, stripped of the authority that had ruled hundreds of lives with a glance. "What do you want?" He finally stammered, his voice cracking high and thin, betraying the terror he could no longer mask. Brutus lifted the sledgehammer overhead, the 20 pounds of forged steel catching the furnace's glow, until it looked like molten fire torn from the devil's forge. In that instant, he seemed larger, towering not just in body, but in spirit, as if every lash and every cruelty suffered by his people had gathered into his arms for this single blow. Just as Brutus said, and the hammer fell. The sound that followed was beyond description, a sickening explosive crack that tore through skull and silence alike. Sloth's body collapsed with a thud, but Brutus did not stop. Again and again the hammer came down, each strike accompanied by the crunch of bone, the splatter of blood, the hiss of flesh searing on the furnace floor. By the time the hammer stilled, Cornelius Sloth no longer had a face, only a steaming pool of blood and brain that spread across the hot iron like molten wax. The stench of scorched flesh and smoke was so unbearable that hardened men gagged and vomited where they stood. Brutus set the bloodied hammer aside, turned to the ring of stunned witnesses, and spoke as calmly as if he were asking for water. "Somebody better send for the sheriff. I'll be waiting right here." News of the murder traveled faster than fire through dry pine. By nightfall, Montgomery's governor was already briefed, and whispers churned through the South's planter class. A slave had not only killed his master, he had done so deliberately in front of witnesses and then surrendered without fear. This was no chaotic rebellion to be crushed with gallows and spectacle. This was something more dangerous, a calculated act that hinted at deeper rot beneath the surface of their world. Within 2 hours, Jefferson County Sheriff Thomas Whitfield rode in with a 12-man posse armed and ready for carnage. They expected a riot, perhaps dozens dead. Instead, what they found unsettled them far more. The foundry roared on furnaces, blazing hammers, falling slaves working as if nothing had happened. Near furnace number 3, The blood still steamed, but order reigned. Brutus Caldwell sat on a wooden crate at the scene of his crime. Massive hands folded, posture serene, his face wearing an expression of peace. He had cleaned the gore from his skin and clothes with foundry rags. He did not resist when the shackles came. "I killed Cornelius Sloth," he told the sheriff. "I did it deliberate, and I'd do it again. I got no regrets." When Whitfield asked why, Brutus gave an answer that froze the room. "Ask his ledgers, Sheriff. Ask what he wrote in his private books. Ask what he did to the ones who came before me. Ask why 43 people went away from here and never came back." The slaves who remained said nothing. They worked as if deaf and blind, their faces blank masks. Questioned one by one, they denied knowledge of ledgers or missing men. They admitted only to witnessing the killing, nothing more. To them, Brutus had always been quiet, steady, obedient, the perfect slave. The violence, they insisted, came from nowhere, like lightning splitting a summer sky, sudden, merciless, and gone, leaving only ruin behind. Sheriff Whitfield wasn't fooled by the blank stares and denials. In 15 years of law enforcement across Jefferson County, he had seen plenty of slave uprisings, and they all fit the same script: an immediate spark, an emotional explosion, chaos, bodies on the ground, and discipline shattered beyond repair. Brutus Caldwell was nothing like that. His clothes were clean, his voice steady, his presence calm and deliberate. This wasn't madness. It was a man executing a decision he had planned long before the hammer fell. The search of Cornelius Sloth's private office proved it. Inside the administrative building, Whitfield and his deputies uncovered a cache of ledgers, correspondence, and financial records that revealed horrors even hardened men struggled to process. The ledgers read like laboratory notes, reducing slaves to test subjects in a grotesque experiment, where pain, hunger, and exhaustion were variables to be measured. They cataloged how long a man could work without food before collapsing, how many pounds of flesh could be stripped away before strength failed, how sleep deprivation sharpened or dulled productivity. Charts compared the effectiveness of punishments, weighing the productivity gains of lashes, starvation, and psychological threats against the inevitable decline toward death. Whole families were broken down into entries of controllability, obedience, and expendability. Human beings reduced to the cold calculus of cost efficiency. But the most damning discovery was the correspondence. Sloth had been in league with Dr. Josiah Knott, a respected physician in Mobile and one of the South's most vocal champions of racial pseudoscience. The letters, written in Sloth's hand and sealed with his mark, described a partnership that turned his foundry into a supplier for Knott's so-called racial medicine. Enslaved men and women were shipped to Mobile in modified railroad cars, their bodies sold for up to $500 each, depending on age, condition, and research suitability. They were never expected to return. The letters spoke clinically of subjects detailing physical traits, illnesses, and resilience, as if cataloging livestock. The experiments ranged from crude surgical procedures performed without anesthesia to deliberate infection, with diseases all under the guise of scientific advancement. Knott referred to these atrocities as terminal studies designed to prove African Americans' supposed biological inferiority and justify their perpetual enslavement. Whitfield understood at once the magnitude of what he was holding. This wasn't a case of one cruel master exploiting his property. It was an entire machine of murder and science intertwined its gears, greased by profit and respectability. Dr. Knott wasn't a fringe figure to be easily discredited. He was celebrated in Southern society, cited in courts, funded by medical schools, published in journals that lawmakers used as justification for slavery's moral and intellectual foundation. To expose him would not only topple reputations, but call into question the very philosophy upon which the South's entire system rested. If his research was revealed as nothing more than torture and murder, then the legal and scientific scaffolding of slavery itself might begin to crack. And so Sheriff Whitfield made a choice. He buried the truth. He concealed the most damning evidence shielding men whose crimes were far greater than Brutus Caldwell's. It was a decision that preserved the power of the guilty, destroyed the possibility of justice for the dead, and condemned Brutus to bear the weight of a crime whose roots stretched far deeper than a single swing of a hammer. Sheriff Whitfield made his choice quietly but decisively. He confiscated every ledger and letter, told his deputies the search had uncovered nothing of consequence, and ordered the destruction of all evidence linking Cornelius Sloth to the experimental program. The official report reduced the murder to something mundane, a workplace dispute, a grudge, the inexplicable violence of a slave against his master. But Whitfield, though bound by politics, wasn't entirely corrupt. He couldn't bring himself to erase the truth completely. He made copies of the most damning documents, sealed them in a tin box, and buried them beneath the floorboards of his home. He told himself he was preserving them for a time when justice could be done without tearing apart the fragile social order. Deep down, however, the reason was more human. He could not bring himself to destroy the only proof that 43 lives had been taken in secret agony, sacrificed to greed and pseudoscience. On January 18, 1859, the trial of Brutus Caldwell opened at the Jefferson County Courthouse. The building itself, with its red brick and white columns, was meant to project classical ideals of justice. But everyone knew its function was theater, not truth. Alabama law was clear. A slave who murdered his master would hang. Trials were usually short rituals lasting a day, at most designed to reassure slaveholders that the state would protect their lives while maintaining the facade of due process for the enslaved. But this trial would not follow the script. The reason was Benjamin Carver, the young lawyer appointed to represent Brutus. Carver was 26, a recent Harvard law graduate, and the son of a minister raised to believe in the inherent dignity of human beings. His years in Boston had exposed him to abolitionist ideals and constitutional debates rarely heard in Alabama courtrooms. Returning home, he had hoped to reconcile Northern principles of justice with Southern realities. But the daily compromises of practicing law in a slave state had already begun to corrode his youthful optimism. Court-appointed defense of slaves was usually a formality, a gesture to meet legal standards before the inevitable sentence was carried out. Carver was expected to play his part, offer perfunctory words of defense, and step aside. Instead, he treated the case as something more. Unlike most lawyers who met their clients only minutes before trial, Carver visited Brutus in solitary confinement multiple times. He listened, took notes, and slowly uncovered a story far more complex than a moment of rebellion. Brutus revealed that he was literate, a crime in itself punishable by whipping or worse, and that he had used this forbidden skill to create his own records. For years hidden away in scraps of paper sewn into the lining of his late father's coat, he had documented everything he witnessed at Sloth Ironworks. His journal was meticulous: names, dates, methods, the fates of the vanished. It expanded upon Sloth's ledgers, but from the perspective of the enslaved, turning statistics into testimony and experiments into crimes against humanity. What Carver now held was not just evidence of one man's murder, but a narrative that could unravel the foundations of slavery's moral defense. And he knew that bringing it into the courtroom would turn Brutus Caldwell's trial into something far larger than Alabama's elite ever intended. Brutus Caldwell's quiet revelation to Benjamin Carver reframed everything. He wasn't simply striking down a cruel master in a fit of rage. He was preempting his own execution. He had seen too much. He had watched men and women shackled inside modified railroad cars, their bodies strapped down like livestock, drugged into submission for transport to Mobile. He had marked each selection in his journal, watched names disappear from the quarters, and realized with icy certainty that his own name was next. December 20th, 1858. 5 days after Cornelius Sloth's skull shattered beneath his hammer. "I wasn't murdering my master," Mr. Carver Brutus explained with unflinching calm. "I was fighting for my life, and for theirs too. Sloth was feeding us to that doctor one by one, like chickens to a fox. If I let him send me off, there'd be no one left to tell the truth." Carver now held something incendiary. Not just the testimony of a doomed slave, but evidence that could rewrite the legal treatment of slavery itself. Brutus's journals aligned with Sheriff Whitfield's hidden documents. Yet they went further, naming railroad men, government officials, and judges complicit in the machinery of human experimentation. If used recklessly, such evidence could spark a backlash that might worsen conditions for every enslaved person in Alabama. If ignored, it would vanish into the smoke like the 43 lives already lost. Carver needed a strategy, a way to pull the truth into daylight without appearing to hurl wild accusations at the most powerful men in the South. His solution was daring. He would force the conspirators to expose themselves. By calling them as character witnesses for Cornelius Sloth, he could compel them to speak under oath, then dismantle their credibility with carefully aimed questions. At the center of this plan stood Dr. Josiah Nott, a man so convinced of his own genius that Carver knew he would eagerly walk into the trap. On January 23, 1859, Dr. Nott entered the courtroom expecting nothing more than routine testimony. He was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in his finest black wool suit, silk vest, and polished boots. He carried himself with the easy assurance of a man accustomed to reverence a physician whose publications on racial science were quoted by lawmakers and judges across the South. His reputation made him untouchable, at least that was what he believed. The prosecutor's questions were gentle, allowing Nott to speak at length about Cornelius Sloth as a progressive businessman who valued the health of his workers. He painted Sloth as enlightened, even benevolent, a man who had consulted medical experts to ensure proper care for his slaves. Nott, confident and unchallenged, spoke warmly of Sloth's contributions to Alabama's industrial growth. But then Benjamin Carver rose. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but his questions cut like a scalpel. "Doctor," he began, "you've described Mr. Sloth as someone who consulted with you regarding the care of his slaves. Could you tell the court more specifically about the nature of these consultations?" Not unaware of how much Carver truly knew, launched into the language of a lecture hall. He spoke clinically about his research program, about techniques for studying anatomy and physiology, about advances in understanding Negro physiology and the effects of various labor conditions. "Our research," he declared, "was designed to explore pain tolerance recovery rates from procedures and the physical performance of laborers under different conditions." It was groundbreaking work, already contributing to respected publications. Carver let him talk each word, pulling the noose tighter. The courtroom, packed with planters, merchants, and townsfolk, listened in uneasy silence as the doctor described in clinical terms the suffering of men and women they all recognized as neighbors' property. What Nott considered scientific triumphs sounded to others like confessions of brutality dressed in the language of progress. Carver had let Dr. Nott's arrogance build the scaffold for his own undoing. Each innocent question drew out another damning admission, the doctor describing with clinical pride the kind of suffering that froze the courtroom into horrified silence. Amputations without anesthesia, deliberate infections to study disease experiments on pain tolerance that treated screams as data points. He spoke of people as specimens, praising Sloth's ability to provide prime subjects conditioned by years of brutal labor. The word hung in the air like a curse, and even in a society steeped in slavery, there were boundaries that had just been shattered. For a brief moment, it seemed the trial had turned. But power moves quickly when threatened. Judge Samuel Crawford recessed the proceedings and summoned Carver into his chambers. Waiting inside were two men in expensive suits, representatives of the Alabama Medical Society and the Montgomery Railroad Company. Their message was unambiguous enough. Dr. Knott's research was too valuable to discredit the railroads too entangled in contracts, the system itself too dependent on the illusion of benevolence. "You've made your point," Crawford told him coldly. "But if you continue, you'll bring down institutions this state depends on. Brutus Caldwell will hang. Nothing you do will change that." That night, Carver's office was ransacked. Papers scattered, his safe forced open. Most importantly, Brutus's hidden journal, the only physical record of the selection lists, was gone. But the burglars overlooked one thing: transcripts Carver had concealed inside the frame of his Harvard diploma. It wasn't much, but it was enough. On January 25, 1859, the Jefferson County Courthouse overflowed with spectators, rumors spreading that something unprecedented was about to happen. Tobacco smoke curled under the rafters, the air heavy with anticipation. When Carver rose to address the jury, he abandoned the carefully crafted legal arguments expected of him. Instead, he spoke directly to the men in the box, his voice steady, deliberate, and unflinching. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "imagine it was your son, your brother, your father. Imagine he had been sold to a man who treated human beings like laboratory rats. Imagine that man had already fed 43 souls to a doctor who cut them apart while still alive, studying their screams as though they were birdsong. And imagine your loved one was next 5 days from now. What would you do?" The prosecutor leapt to his feet with an objection. Judge Crawford sustained it, irritation etched into his face. But the question lingered heavy as lead. Carver had broken decorum, yes, but he had also cracked the veneer of inevitability. He had forced everyone in that room to face the question they feared most: when does murder become survival? The days that followed brought a parade of witnesses whose testimony broadened the conspiracy. Railroad men admitted loading modified cars, puzzled by the restraints bolted to the walls. Clerks confessed to signing permits for medical shipments without daring to ask what they contained. Disillusioned assistants from Dr. Knott's clinic described patients who never returned. Piece by piece, Carver exposed the network that linked Birmingham's foundries, Mobile's laboratories, and Montgomery's government offices in a seamless chain of cruelty. The effect was electric. What had begun as a trial of one enslaved man became an indictment of an entire system. The public, drawn to the courthouse, expecting a swift conviction, now found themselves confronting truths they had spent years ignoring. Whispers filled the hallways. Spectators shifted uneasily in their seats. The pillars of Southern society, men in polished boots and fine suits, were being dragged into the mud of their own making. When Carver recalled Dr. Knott to the stand, the shift was unmistakable. Gone was the untouchable authority, replaced by a man rattled and defensive. His answers faltered, his arrogance curdled into resentment. And as Carver bore down with quiet, relentless precision, the courtroom felt something no one had expected to feel in Alabama in 1859. The possibility, however faint, that justice might not bend forever to power. Carver's cross-examination shifted from careful probing to a relentless assault. His voice carried the weight of a prosecutor hammering Dr. Knott with questions that tore through the doctor's facade of respectability. "Do you deny amputating limbs from living subjects without anesthesia?" he demanded. Knott stammered about legitimate research, his earlier confidence dissolving into defensive hedging. "Do you deny deliberately infecting children with disease to watch it progress? Do you deny performing surgeries on pregnant women to study the effects on their unborn children?" Each question struck like a lash, and every evasive answer only deepened the horror. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, forced to confront atrocities spoken aloud in clinical detail by the man who committed them. The coup de grace, however, came from an unexpected witness, Martha Sloth. Summoned by the prosecution to praise her husband's character, she instead revealed the nightmare that had consumed their marriage. Cornelius, she said, was haunted by screams. He couldn't silence sounds of men and women who knew what awaited them. He barely slept, kept a pistol by the bed, and muttered of business dealings that would destroy us all. She wept as she admitted that just days before his death, he had told her of a hidden safe in their home and urged her to reveal its contents if anything happened to him. Sheriff Whitfield retrieved the safe's contents under court order, carrying them into the courthouse in a heavy satchel. What he laid out on the defense table stripped away all pretense ledgers, manifests, and letters linking Sloth directly to Dr. Nutt and his network. Payments totaling over $20,000, shipping records of specimens transported to Mobile, and correspondence from government officials, smoothing the way for human cargo. But it was a final unsent letter that shattered the last defenses of denial. Written in Cornelius Sloth's own hand, dated December 10, 1858. It was part confession, part plea for absolution. He admitted the partnership with Dr. Nutt had profited him beyond dreams, but destroyed his soul. He feared divine retribution and confessed his terror of Brutus Caldwell, whose watchful eyes seemed to know everything. He planned to ship Brutus to Mobile with the next specimen, and then abandon the business before it consumed them all. I pray that God will forgive me, the letter concluded. Read aloud by the court clerk, the letter transformed the trial. No longer was Brutus Caldwell a slave lashing out in violence. He was a man who struck to save himself from certain torture and death. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict that defied the expectations of everyone in the South. Not guilty by reason of self-defense. The decision was unprecedented, a crack in the edifice of slavery's legal structure. In that moment, Alabama's courtroom became the stage for a truth that power had fought desperately to bury that. Even in bondage, the right to life and resistance could not be completely denied. The evidence against Cornelius Sloth and Dr. Nutt had been so damning, so undeniable that 12 white jurors in Alabama, men steeped in the laws of slavery, were forced to render a verdict no one thought possible. The foreman, William Hayes, later admitted to the Montgomery Advertiser that the question was never whether Brutus Caldwell killed his master, but whether any man, regardless of color, had the right to defend himself against torture and murder. Once we read that letter, Hayes said the decision became clear. If we wouldn't hang a white man for defending himself from being carved alive, how could we in good conscience hang a Negro for the same thing? The verdict, not guilty by reason of self-defense, sent shockwaves through the courthouse. The crowd erupted, some clapping, some weeping, others staring in stunned disbelief. For the briefest moment, Alabama's legal system had recognized the humanity of an enslaved man and his right to survival. But celebration was short-lived. Within hours, state officials rushed in to contain the fallout. New charges were manufactured: destruction of property, conspiracy against commerce, inciting rebellion, interference with legitimate business. All thinly veiled attempts to erase the precedent. Governor Andrew Moore issued a public statement days later. While the jury's verdict reflected unique circumstances, Alabama could not allow a dangerous precedent that might encourage other slaves to take the law into their own hands. Brutus Caldwell would not go free. Benjamin Carver, who had risked everything to defend him, paid the price as well. His legal career collapsed overnight. Branded a traitor to his class, he turned his skills to the Underground Railroad, using his knowledge of Southern law to guide fugitives north. The transcripts of Brutus's trial, smuggled out of Alabama, were printed in abolitionist papers across New England. The story of medical experiments on slaves horrified Northern readers and gave abolitionists fresh ammunition in the growing national conflict that would soon erupt into war. Dr. Josiah Nott fled Alabama within a week, his name now synonymous with atrocity. Stripped of his credentials and banished from respectable institutions, he spent his last years as a traveling quack selling patent medicines to rural towns. Once celebrated as a man of science, he died in 1873. Forgotten and disgraced, his theories on racial medicine buried not by enlightenment, but by the courage of a slave who refused to submit quietly. The Sloth Iron Works limped on under new owners, but the stain of scandal never lifted. After the Civil War, freedmen returned as paid laborers, but they carried memories too raw to ignore. Productivity faltered, and whispers spread of strange happenings in the furnaces. Night watchmen and maintenance crews spoke of phantom hammer blows echoing through the empty foundry, steady rhythmic strikes like the beat of Brutus Caldwell's sledge. Searchers could never find the source. The sound always stopped just before they arrived, only to begin again in another part of the plant. For more than a century, workers told stories of the foundry being haunted not by one ghost, but by the echoes of slavery's victims, their eternal labor etched into the iron and stone. As for Brutus, the state made sure he never walked free. For 37 more years, Alabama's prisons held him under one fabricated charge after another. Yet captivity did not break him. He became a teacher smuggling knowledge into the darkest corners of confinement. In hidden lessons whispered by candlelight, he taught fellow prisoners to read and write, defying laws meant to keep them in ignorance. To those men, Brutus Caldwell was not just a convict, he was proof that even in chains, a man could wield truth as his greatest weapon. Brutus Caldwell's defiance didn't end with the swing of a hammer it carried forward for nearly 40 years inside prison walls. More than a survivor, he became a teacher, a guide, and a chronicler. He taught fellow prisoners to read and write. But more importantly, he showed them how to preserve their own voices. Under his mentorship, men who had once been silenced by law and fear began documenting their lives, the brutalities of sharecropping, the cruelty of convict leasing, and the endless tricks used to keep black labor chained long after slavery was declared over. Through smuggled letters slipped past guards or entrusted to sympathetic ministers, Brutus's words reached beyond the bars. Written in the same tight, meticulous script that had once recorded Sloth's atrocities, his letters carried guidance and courage to African Americans across the South, who were trying to navigate a freedom that often existed only on paper. His influence spread quietly, but powerfully, like roots pushing through stone. When Brutus Caldwell died on November 15, 1896, at the age of 69, his body finally broken by decades of prison labor. The ripples of his life were undeniable. Hundreds came to his funeral, men and women who had learned to read under his guidance, who had passed along his words, who had seen him stand unbroken in the face of a system designed to erase him. His last words, recorded by the prison chaplain, who had become his confidant, were simple, direct, and unflinching. "I did what I had to do, and I'd do it again. The only thing I regret is that I couldn't save the others who went before me." Though the truth of the experimental program was buried under decades of cover-ups by officials, doctors, and businessmen, history has a way of clawing back what men try to suppress. In 1987, a renovation crew working on the former home of Sheriff Thomas Whitfield discovered a rusted tin box hidden beneath the kitchen floorboards. Inside were the documents Whitfield had secretly preserved: Sloth's ledgers, Nott's letters, financial records, and shipping manifests. The proof of everything. Today, those records sit in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, silent witnesses to a conspiracy that once reached into every corner of Southern power. Brutus Caldwell's story reminds us of a terrible truth: history's greatest crimes are not always committed by monsters, but by ordinary men who convince themselves that cruelty serves a higher purpose. It forces us to ask, was Brutus justified in taking the law into his own hands when the law itself was designed to destroy him? Could something like this happen again, hidden under the smoke of progress, justified by science, or disguised as necessity? Or have we truly learned enough from the past to stop history from repeating itself? If this story unsettled you, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave your thoughts in the comments, because the most terrifying stories are often the ones that could be true. And this one, perhaps more than most, lingers like the echo of a hammer in an empty foundry.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.